Welcome to The Power of Tax Defense Attorneys, Tax Corner with Juda Gabaie.
Welcome to The Power of Tax Defense Attorneys, Tax Corner with Juda Gabaie. I'm your host, Evan Mack, and today's episode is representing clients in tax court when and why litigation matters. Juda, welcome back, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
All right, let's get into this information that's going to help these people at home. And can you talk about at what point does a tax dispute escalate to the level where going to tax court even makes sense?
Okay, so how tax court works, it's actually a very significant step in resolving tax disputes, and understanding why to go there could be critical, right? In order to go to tax court, you have to get something called a notice of deficiency or a notice of determination. A notice of deficiency is basically the government saying, hey, we are going to go ahead and say that you owe this certain amount of money to the IRS. You now have the ability to file a petition for U.S. tax court. It's a 90-day notice to file this petition to U.S. tax court. And generally how it works is when a person gets audited, you have the administrative level of audit, right? And then you have appeals. And if you fail to resolve it in appeal, then you get this notice of deficiency. And that notice of deficiency is what gives you the opportunity to go to U.S. tax court. And then when you go to the U.S. tax court, that's when you try to get it resolved with the IRS. And generally, you want to go to U.S. tax court when there's a significant amount in dispute. And the stakes are high because tax court could get very expensive to retain an attorney and to go through it. So you want to speak to a professional and see if it makes sense to actually go to U.S. tax court. Another opportunity is called a notice of determination, which means that let's say you already have this liability and you believe that you should be able to get into a certain payment plan or a certain resolution, and the IRS collections department denied you that. Then usually, if you're an appeal and they give you this notice of determination, you now have the ability to go to tax court. So you have a few options when it comes to going to tax court, depending on what stage you're at in your case.
So can you walk us through what it's like to represent someone in the U.S. tax court and how it compares to maybe other forums?
Yes. So what happens is you file a petition for U.S. tax court to represent an individual or business, right? When you file that petition, then that's where the IRS, counsel gets involved. And IRS counsel goes ahead and either assigns an appeal agent to your case to try to get it resolved. Remember, judges are assigned to the case when it's ready to go to trial. And they'll try to get, they're scheduling conferences to try to get the case resolved and into some sort of settlement. There is no juries, right? It's most of the time when you have a tax court cases, they're tried before a single judge, right? And the process is pretty streamlined. And the goal is to try to get the case resolved. There's a few different ways to file a petition. There's the informal rules, right? And that's for disputes under 50,000. And if you owe more than 50,000, or if they're alleging you owe more than 50,000, that's when you go ahead and then it's formal, and that's where you file it on a petition. The goal is to try to get the case resolved through a tax court. It's a bit more complicated, but there could be pretty good resolution when you go into tax court.
What are the recurring types of tax disputes that you frequently see that land in tax court? What are the inherent roadblocks that prevents these particular issues from being resolved through maybe a standard negotiation?
So generally is where there is a dispute, right? If an individual or business gets audited, there is a dispute as to documentation. There could be a dispute as to the substantiation of issues, right? Where the IRS is disallowing or they're increasing income for certain reasons, and that's where you have a dispute with them. And that's where you want to take it to tax court to try to get it resolved. There could be the issue of a hobby loss versus business activity. There could be penalties that you disagree with, like accuracy related penalties. There could be the issue of like worker classification, where the IRS is stating that some of these 1099 should be W-2 employees. There could be the reasonable compensation. Are you getting paid reasonable? And then they could also be the trust fund recovery penalty. So there's a number of factors, reoccurring types of disputes that could land into tax court. But generally, the main ones tend to be audit substantiation issues and collection due process, notice of determination. You're not satisfied with the IRS notice of determination and you want to take it to tax court. And that's where, those two tend to be the types of tax disputes that you frequently see in U.S. tax court.
When negotiation fails, what unique leverage or resolution pathways does the tax court offer that are, simply maybe unavailable through other IRS administrative processes?
Right. So the most unique leverage is obviously you're getting an impartial judge. You get an independent judicial review by a tax judge and not an IRS employee. And this offers like an objective forum to evaluate the facts and legal arguments. And at the same time, in some cases, the burden of proof shifts. If the taxpayer introduces credible evidence, maintains records, or cooperates with the IRS, the burden of proof can shift to the IRS on factual issues, which could be a powerful advantage. And not only that, you also have expanded discovery tools, right? The tax court has formal discovery procedures that allow you to compel the IRS to provide information. There's precedents, and then there's also the opportunity to do settlements with IRS, chief counsel. So those are, big points, and those are definitely unique leverages that are offered in tax court. And that's something that, in some cases we would highly recommend our clients to do.
So taking a client to tax court involves more than just legal strategy. How do you kind of holistically prepare them legally, emotionally, financially for this demanding, experience for tax litigation?
So legally, you want to do a thorough case analysis, deep dive into all the facts, documents, and relevant tax law to identify the strengths, the weaknesses, and the potential arguments. Obviously, evidence gathering, right? You want to get all the supporting documentations and expert reports if those are needed, right? Understanding the procedure, educating your client on how the court rules work and how discovery works. Those are very important. And then there's always a strategic planning, developing a clear legal strategy, and the potential settlement positions and outcomes that could come out. Emotionally, it could be tough, right? Especially because there's time, there's cost, there's stress, there's the potential outcome, and those are issues that taxpayers have on top of their head. And like I mentioned, financially, it could be expensive, but it all depends on what the issues are and what points you have and what are you disputing with the government. So those are few things that that a practitioner will speak with their client about in terms of when going to tax court.
So, Judah, can you share a story where your decision to litigate a case in tax court ultimately delivered a significant and positive outcome for your client? That would have maybe what somebody else might not been able to pull off.
Yeah, certainly. I can recall a bunch of cases where we were representing a business owner who had significant amount of deductions for their business, and the IRS disallowed a lot of these expenses, and for various reasons. One, insufficient substantiation. But my client had paid for many of these items for their business. It was reasonable and necessary for the business. And, we filed an appeal, but in appeals, the case got thrown around, and then we finally got a notice of deficiency. When we got this notice of deficiency, we took it to tax court. In tax court, we actually provided all this documentation to counsel and appeal and said, look, we provided all this information. Look at the substantiation. And remember, we have to organize the documents. You want to be as organized as possible, and you want to be as transparent as possible. And we recently did this on a case where it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential tax liability. And at the end of the day, the IRS came back to us, counsel came back to us and said, hey, look, we agree with you. We're going to go ahead and remove all this deficiency. The documentations are there. And we settled the case with the IRS, meaning that we agreed. I think the liability at the end was maybe $1,000 or something like that. And we were willing, my client was willing to pay that. And the case closed out. And we had another case just recently also where they got hit with a huge penalty, accuracy-related penalty. And we disagreed with the government's assessment on it. And we went ahead and petitioned for U.S. tax court. And we spoke to Office of Chief Counsel for the IRS. And we indicated, said, look, this doesn't go with the IRM rules. And counsel agreed with us, and they removed it. And case was closed. We closed out the case. So there is a tremendous amount of leverage when going to tax court. When you have the right facts, the right arguments, those are very important stuff. And I always tell my clients it's very important to be organized. And many times when we go to tax court, we wouldn't go if we don't see light at the end of the tunnel. Because it's a long process, it's a thorough process, it's a difficult process, it's emotional and it's financial, and those are important. So there's trial dates that are potentially coming up. So it can get very hectic. So yeah. That's why I always tell my clients, let's evaluate the facts, let's evaluate all this stuff, and then ultimately we'll make a decision whether it makes sense to go to tax court, and then we'll go from there.
So now for all these taxpayers or professionals considering legal representation in tax court, what are the absolute key qualities, experience, and expertise they should be looking for in a tax court attorney?
So one of the main things I always tell my clients is look for somebody that all they do is tax controversy or tax court litigation, right? If you're going to hire somebody to represent you for a tax issue, make sure that's all they do, right? They're an attorney and they practice in that area, and they have done that before. I think that's very important, right? When you go to a doctor for a heart issue, you're going to go to a cardiologist. You're not going to go to a general doctor. Right. So you want to go to somebody that understands, has a deep expertise in tax law, the procedure, has experience in dealing with the IRS, right? Has experience in dealing with appeals with the IRS chief counsel. Those are very important. There's reputation on the line. They understand the IRS position. They understand the negotiation tactics done in order to try to get a case resolved. Those are very important, right? Because the IRS, when you hire a tax attorney to represent you, there's reputation, right? There's the IRS counsel knows that attorney. So they know that this attorney knows what they're doing. They have done this before, and it actually helps to expedite the case because you understand each other. And I believe those are very, very, very important. And I always stress this out to taxpayers. If you're looking to hire an attorney for tax court, make sure you do some research. Do your due diligence. Look out for an attorney that understands tax court procedures and understands tax law, and hopefully they should be able to get you into a great resolution.
Juda, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you. As always, looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening to The Power of Tax Defense Attorneys, Tax Corner with Juda Gabaie. To connect with Juda, visit reliabletaxattorney.com. And remember to leave us a comment, like, subscribe, leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like, and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.